The streets of Atlanta shimmer with late summer heat as Officer Derek Barnes steers his patrol car through the predominantly black neighborhood of Sweet Auburn. His fingers tap impatiently on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the streets with obvious disdain. The dashboard clock reads 2:15 p.m., another 4 hours left in his shift. Barnes has been with the Atlanta Police Department for 12 years, earning a reputation among his colleagues for what they euphemistically call aggressive policing. His personnel file contains 6 civilian complaints, all dismissed without investigation. The truth is, Barnes sees his beat as enemy territory rather than a community to protect and serve. Through his open window, Barnes observes children playing basketball in a community center lot. His lip curls slightly as he slows down, causing the kids to stop their game and watch his car pass with wary expressions. This is the impact of his presence, fear rather than safety. The police radio crackles to life. Dispatch to Unit 274, we have a report of suspicious activity at Martin Luther King Jr. Food Market. Caller reports an elderly black female possibly distributing unauthorized materials. Please investigate. Barnes straightens in his seat, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Unit 274 responding. En route to location. He makes a sharp U-turn, tires squealing against the asphalt. Meanwhile, inside the Martin Luther King Jr. Food Market, Alice Turner moves with quiet dignity through the aisles. At 68, she carries herself with the bearing of someone who has seen both struggle and triumph. Her silver hair is neatly styled, and she wears a pressed floral dress, the picture of a respectable grandmother. The store owner, Mr. Johnson, greets her warmly. Ms. Alice, good to see you again. How's the community outreach going? Alice pulls out a stack of pamphlets from her shoulder bag. Just trying to make sure our people know their rights, especially with all these incidents lately. The pamphlets detail citizens' legal rights during police encounters, information about local civil rights organizations, and resources for reporting police misconduct. Several customers gather around, taking pamphlets and engaging in quiet conversation. Alice has been a fixture in this community for decades, though few know her full story. Her gentle demeanor masks years of experience and purpose. As she prepares to leave the store, Alice carefully places her remaining pamphlets in her bag. The afternoon sun casts long shadows through the store's windows, and she can see Officer Barnes's patrol car pulling into the parking lot. Her expression remains neutral, but her posture subtly shifts, the stance of someone who has learned to be prepared for anything. Barnes exits his vehicle, adjusting his belt with deliberate slowness. His body camera is conspicuously turned off. Through the store windows, his gaze fixes on Alice like a predator spotting prey, unaware that he's about to make the biggest mistake of his career. Alice steps through the automatic doors into the humid Atlanta afternoon. The tension in the air is palpable as Barnes begins to approach her, his hand resting casually on his holster. The stage is set for a confrontation that will spark a movement, though neither participant yet realizes the magnitude of what's about to unfold. The confrontation begins innocuously enough. Barnes approaches Alice, deliberately invading her personal space. Ma'am, I need to see some identification. We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area. Alice maintains her composure, reaching slowly for her purse. Officer, I'm simply leaving the grocery store. May I ask what suspicious activity you're referring to? Barnes cuts her off, his voice rising. I don't need to explain myself to you. Show me your ID now. His hand remains on his holster, a posture of intimidation he's perfected over years of similar encounters. Across the parking lot, Maria Rodriguez sits in her car, having just finished her own shopping. The young nursing student immediately recognizes the warning signs of what's unfolding. Without drawing attention, she pulls out her phone and begins recording. I'm reaching for my wallet now, officer, Alice says clearly, her movements deliberate and slow. But Barnes has already decided how this interaction will play out. Before she can retrieve her identification, he grabs her arm roughly. Stop resisting. Barnes shouts, though Alice hasn't made any threatening moves. The absurdity of the accusation hangs in the humid air, a 68-year-old grandmother supposedly resisting arrest while calmly reaching for her ID. What happens next unfolds in a matter of seconds. Barnes twists Alice's arm behind her back with unnecessary force. She cries out in pain, her shoulder wrenching at an unnatural angle. Her pamphlets scatter across the pavement, dancing in the hot Atlanta breeze. Maria's hand shakes as she continues recording, but she keeps the phone steady enough to capture everything. Barnes forcing Alice face down onto the scorching pavement, his knee pressing into her back, her glasses skittering across the asphalt. The timestamp on the video will later become crucial evidence, 2:47 p.m., August 15th. Several bystanders gather, their voices rising in protest. "She's an old lady," someone shouts. "What are you doing?" calls another. Barnes ignores them all, seeming to take pleasure in the display of power. When he finally allows Alice to stand, her dress is torn and dirty. A thin trickle of blood runs from a scrape on her cheek where it hit the pavement. She remains eerily dignified despite the assault, her eyes meeting Barnes's with an intensity that, for just a moment, seems to unsettle him. "Have a nice day, ma'am," Barnes sneers, releasing her with a slight shove. He turns away, chuckling to himself as he walks back to his patrol car. "These people need to learn respect," he mutters loudly enough for others to hear. Maria stops recording only after Barnes's car disappears around the corner. Her hands are shaking so badly now that she nearly drops her phone. The video is 4 minutes and 23 seconds long, more than enough to capture the entire incident in brutal clarity. Several people rush to help Alice, but she waves them off, slowly straightening her dress. "I'm fine," she assures them, though she's clearly in pain. "Just help me gather these pamphlets, please." Her voice is steady, but those close enough can see the fire burning in her eyes. What no one present realizes, not Barnes, not the witnesses, not even Maria with her damning video, is that this incident will become the catalyst for a chain of events that will shake the Atlanta Police Department to its core. Barnes has just assaulted a federal agent, and his actions have been captured in high definition. By nightfall, Maria Rodriguez's video has exploded across social media platforms. The hashtag Justice for Alice trends nationally, with the view count climbing past 1 million within hours. Major news networks pick up the story, running the footage on repeat during their evening broadcasts. The video's impact is devastating in its clarity: an elderly black woman, obviously no threat, being brutally manhandled by a white police officer outside a grocery store. Every replay shows Barnes's smirk, the unnecessary force, the scattered pamphlets about civil rights lying symbolically crushed on the ground. In a secure office building downtown, Alice sits across from FBI Special Agent Marcus Chen, holding an ice pack to her shoulder. "We need to move on this now," she says, her voice firm despite her injuries. "I've spent 8 months investigating corruption in the Atlanta PD. This incident gives us the opening we need." Chen nods, spreading photographs across his desk. "Officer Derek Barnes has been on our radar for months. Known associations with several corrupt officers, suspected evidence tampering, multiple excessive force complaints that mysteriously disappeared." He pauses, studying Alice's bruised face. "But we never expected him to hand us such clear evidence." Meanwhile, across town, 26-year-old Jamal Washington watches the video for the 10th time in his small apartment. As a community organizer, he's seen countless examples of police brutality, but this one hits differently. He recognizes Alice from community meetings, always quiet, always observant, always taking notes. Now he understands why. Jamal's phone hasn't stopped buzzing with messages from other activists. He opens his laptop and begins drafting a call to action, his fingers flying across the keyboard. Within an hour, he's coordinated with local civil rights groups and set up a protest for the following day. The response is immediate and overwhelming. Social media erupts with pledges to attend. Local businesses offer to provide water and supplies for protesters. Civil rights attorneys volunteer their services. What started as a simple social media post transforms into a movement overnight. Back at the FBI office, Alice reviews her notes from months of undercover work. Barnes isn't just a racist cop, she explains to Chen. He's part of a larger network. They've been systematically targeting minority neighborhoods, planting evidence, filing false reports. The brutality isn't random, it's organized intimidation. Chen slides another file across the desk. "Your assault has created an opportunity. People are watching now. We can use this attention to expose the entire operation." Alice touches her bruised cheek thoughtfully. The community needs to know this isn't just about one bad officer. They need to understand the scale of what we're fighting. As dawn breaks the next morning, Jamal stands on the steps of the Atlanta Police Department headquarters, megaphone in hand. Behind him, a crowd stretches for blocks, students, families, community leaders, all unified in their demand for justice. They carry signs bearing Alice's image and quotes about civil rights. What the protesters don't yet know is that Alice isn't just a victim of police brutality, she's a decorated FBI agent with decades of experience bringing down corrupt law enforcement operations. As the crowd chants for justice, she's already setting in motion a plan that will expose not just Derek Barnes, but an entire system of institutionalized racism and corruption. The morning news shows carry live coverage of the growing protests. In his apartment, Barnes watches the reports with growing unease, finally realizing that his casual act of cruelty may have unexpected consequences. But even he doesn't yet grasp how completely his world is about to unravel. Sarah Mitchell sits in her patrol car, watching the protest footage on her phone during her lunch break. As a 5-year veteran of the Atlanta PD, she's worked alongside Derek Barnes countless times, witnessing his behavior but always staying silent. Now, seeing Alice Turner's battered face on her screen, that silence feels increasingly heavy. The precinct buzzes with nervous energy. Officers cluster in small groups, discussing the growing protests and media coverage. Barnes struts through the hallways with forced bravado, but Sarah notices how other officers have begun to distance themselves from him, their self-preservation instincts kicking in. During the afternoon briefing, Captain Reynolds attempts damage control. "Remember, we stick together. No commenting to the press. Direct all inquiries to the department's public relations office." His eyes scan the room, lingering on Sarah, who's earned a reputation for questioning procedures. Barnes sits in the back, arms crossed, smirking through the briefing. Sarah watches him from across the room, remembering incidents she's witnessed, the misplaced complaint forms, the conveniently malfunctioning body cameras, the roughed-up suspects who resisted arrest. After the meeting, Sarah approaches Barnes in the parking lot. "Derek, we need to talk about what happened with that elderly woman." "Save your bleeding heart routine, Mitchell," Barnes sneers. "The old lady was distributing anti-police propaganda. She got what was coming to her." "She's a grandmother who was leaving a grocery store," Sarah counters, her voice steady. The video shows clear excessive force. Barnes steps closer, lowering his voice. "Watch yourself, Mitchell. You've been riding with us long enough to know how things work. Don't start growing a conscience now." The threat in his voice is unmistakable. Sarah has heard similar warnings before, usually followed by mysterious transfers or officers finding their cars vandalized in the precinct parking lot. Back at her desk, Sarah begins pulling files. She starts with Barnes's incident reports from the past year, noting discrepancies she'd previously ignored. A pattern emerges: excessive force complaints predominantly against minorities, witness statements that disappeared, evidence that never made it to the property room. Her computer dings with an email from Internal Affairs, a mandatory department-wide survey about workplace conduct. Sarah's cursor hovers over the delete button, as she's done many times before. Instead, she opens it, beginning to type about the incidents she's witnessed. Hours pass as Sarah digs deeper. She creates a secure folder on her personal laptop, documenting dates, times, and witness names. Each entry represents a time she stayed silent, a moment when she chose career safety over doing what's right. A knock on her desk startles her. Officer Rodriguez, a rookie, looks nervous. "Hey Mitchell, some of us are talking about Barnes. About other things too. Things we've seen. We thought maybe you'd want to know." Sarah studies the young officer's face, recognizing the same conflict she's feeling. "Close the door," she says quietly. "Tell me everything." As Rodriguez talks, Sarah's documentation grows. It's not just Barnes, it's a system of cover-ups, informal policies, and unwritten rules that protect officers like him while punishing those who speak up. By shift's end, Sarah has filled dozens of pages with notes. She sits in her car, staring at the precinct building, knowing that tomorrow she'll have to walk back in and face the people she's documenting. But Alice Turner's dignified face stays in her mind, along with all the other victims whose stories were buried in misplaced paperwork. Sarah starts her car, her decision made. The question isn't whether to act anymore, but how to do it without becoming another casualty of the system she's preparing to expose. The CNN anchor's voice fills Alice Turner's living room, in an unprecedented development, the victim of last week's viral police brutality incident has been revealed as an undercover FBI agent investigating systemic corruption within the Atlanta Police Department. Alice adjusts her blazer, preparing for her first public appearance since the assault. Her bruises are still visible, but she's chosen not to conceal them. They're evidence, and she wants them seen. Her FBI badge rests heavily against her chest, no longer hidden. Outside the federal building, reporters gather in droves. Jamal Washington has organized supporters to form a protective corridor, ensuring Alice can reach the podium safely. The young activist has emerged as a crucial ally, bridging the gap between federal investigators and the community. "My name is Special Agent Alice Turner," she begins, her voice steady. "For 8 months, I've been investigating corruption within the Atlanta Police Department. Officer Barnes's assault on me was not an isolated incident, it's part of a pattern of systematic abuse of power that we intend to expose fully." The crowd falls silent as Alice methodically outlines examples of police misconduct, falsified reports, missing evidence, targeted harassment of minority communities. Each revelation lands like a hammer blow, backed by her credibility as a federal agent. Meanwhile, Jamal leads a separate press conference in front of the police department. Thousands have gathered, holding signs with Alice's photo and FBI badge. "Agent Turner's story proves what we've been saying for years," he declares. "The system isn't broken, it's functioning exactly as some intended it to." The crowd begins reading names, victims of police brutality whose cases were buried or dismissed. Each name echoes off the building's facade, a litany of injustice that continues for over an hour. Department employees entering and leaving the building have to walk through this gauntlet of accusations. Inside the precinct, internal affairs investigators move through the offices, collecting files and hard drives. Derek Barnes has been placed on administrative leave, but the investigation's scope extends far beyond him. Officers watch nervously as their colleagues are called in for questioning. By evening, the protests have swelled to unprecedented numbers. Jamal orchestrates a powerful display. Protesters lie silently in the street, each holding a file containing a documented case of police misconduct. The image makes national news, a sea of bodies and papers, representing years of suppressed evidence. Alice walks among the protesters, no longer undercover but still observing. She notices officers filming the crowd from rooftops, recognizing surveillance tactics she's documented. But now the power dynamic has shifted, the watchers are being watched. The pressure on the department intensifies. Chief Williams calls an emergency press conference, attempting to distance the department from Barnes. "We are cooperating fully with federal investigators," he announces, sweat visible on his forehead. "Any officers found to have engaged in misconduct will face appropriate consequences." But his words ring hollow against the evidence mounting in Alice's investigation. Her team has already uncovered dozens of cases where the department buried misconduct complaints. Each revelation strengthens the protesters' resolve and weakens the department's authority. As night falls, Jamal leads the crowd in a candlelight vigil. Alice stands beside him, her FBI badge reflecting the flickering lights. Together, they represent a powerful alliance, federal authority and community activism united against corruption. Derek Barnes watches the coverage from his home, realizing his position is increasingly untenable. His phone buzzes constantly with messages from other officers, but fewer and fewer are offering support. The Brotherhood of Silence is cracking under the weight of federal scrutiny. Inside the Atlanta Police Department's records room, Sarah Mitchell works methodically in the pre-dawn hours. Her security clearance gives her access to files most officers can't reach. What she discovers makes her hands shake, a pattern of falsified reports, all digitally signed by a small group of officers, including Barnes. The documents reveal a sophisticated system of corruption. Evidence from drug busts mysteriously disappearing, only to be found in rival gang territories. Excessive force complaints vanishing from the system. Internal affairs investigations suddenly dropped without explanation. Sarah copies everything to an encrypted drive, her police training helping her maintain a clean digital trail. She's seen officers destroyed for less than what she's doing, but each damning document strengthens her resolve. A noise in the hallway freezes her in place. Footsteps approach, then pass. She releases her breath, remembering how Officer Rodriguez's locker was vandalized last week after he questioned Barnes's conduct during a staff meeting. At a small coffee shop across town, Jamal checks his surroundings before entering. Alice Turner sits in a corner booth, looking more like a grandmother than an FBI agent. Sarah arrives moments later, clutching her bag containing the encrypted drive. What I found goes deeper than Barnes, Sarah begins, her voice low. There's a group of officers who call themselves the Cleaners. They handle evidence disposal, complaint suppression, witness intimidation. Barnes is just their enforcer. Alice nods, unsurprised. We've suspected something like this. But we needed proof from inside. Jamal spreads out a map marked with incident locations. These match the pattern of complaints we've received from the community. Targeted harassment, evidence planting, all concentrated in specific neighborhoods. Sarah pulls out her laptop, showing them the digital trail. Every incident has a corresponding deleted complaint. They're thorough, but they didn't expect anyone to look this deep. Alice studies the data, her FBI training picking up patterns. This is organized crime wearing badges. The question is, how high does it go? Their unlikely alliance forms in that coffee shop, a disillusioned cop, an FBI agent, and a community activist, each bringing crucial pieces to the puzzle. Sarah provides internal access, Alice contributes federal resources, and Jamal offers community trust. They develop a plan. Jamal will organize strategic protests, keeping department attention focused on crowd control. Sarah will continue gathering evidence from inside, while Alice coordinates with FBI surveillance teams. There's no going back from this, Alice warns Sarah. Once we move, they'll know someone from inside helped us. Your career here is over. Sarah thinks of all the times she stayed silent, all the injustices she witnessed. My career was over the moment I decided to do what's right. As they leave the coffee shop separately, each carries a piece of the plan. Sarah returns to the precinct, where officers now eye each other with suspicion. Alice heads to the FBI field office to brief her superiors. Jamal begins calling community leaders, preparing for the next phase of protests. None of them notice the unmarked car across the street, where a figure photographs their meeting. Within hours, those photos will reach people who understand exactly what such an alliance threatens. The stage is set for a confrontation that will either expose decades of corruption or destroy those trying to reveal it. For Sarah, every shift now feels like walking through a minefield. For Alice, each piece of evidence brings them closer to justice. For Jamal, every protest carries the weight of his community's hopes. The city of Atlanta simmers with tension. Downtown, thousands gather for what Jamal has dubbed the March for Transparency. Police helicopters circle overhead, their rotors drowning out chants for justice. But this protest is different. The marchers carry copies of official police reports, each one highlighting discrepancies Sarah uncovered. Alice Turner stands at the podium, her FBI credentials visible. Today, we're not just protesting against one incident of brutality. We're exposing a system that has protected corrupt officers for decades. Behind her, large screens display redacted documents, showing patterns of misconduct that can no longer be ignored. Derek Barnes watches the coverage from his living room, his confident facade cracking. His phone keeps ringing, calls from other members of the Cleaners demanding to know if he's talked. His lawyer has stopped responding. The brotherhood of silence that protected him for years is disintegrating. In a desperate move, Barnes arranges an interview with a local news station. This is a witch hunt, he declares, his rehearsed speech falling flat. Agent Turner was distributing anti-police materials. I followed standard procedure. But as he speaks, Sarah sits in an FBI office, playing recorded conversations that prove otherwise. Barnes's voice, captured over months of surveillance, details evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and coordinated harassment campaigns. We own these streets, Barnes's voice crackles through the speakers. Anyone gives us trouble, we know how to handle it. The paperwork always disappears. The timestamp matches perfectly with cases Sarah documented. The recording continues, revealing conversations about targeting specific neighborhoods, coordinating with other corrupt officers, and maintaining their system of intimidation. Each word confirms what the community has known for years but couldn't prove. Jamal leverages these revelations, transforming his protests from expressions of anger into displays of evidence. Marchers carry signs with direct quotes from the recordings, dates of tampered evidence, names of affected community members. The public can no longer dismiss their claims as mere accusations. Barnes attempts damage control, holding a press conference with his police union representative. But halfway through his prepared statement, Sarah releases another batch of documents. Text messages between Barnes and other officers reveal explicit racial bias and premeditated abuse of power. "Your career is over," his union rep tells him bluntly after the cameras stop rolling. "You're toxic now." Everyone's running for cover. That evening, Barnes sits alone in his house, watching as former allies distance themselves. His phone buzzes with a text from another cleaner: "You better keep your mouth shut." The threat carries weight. He knows too well what happens to officers who talk. Outside, protesters maintain a constant presence. Their chants have evolved from general demands for justice to specific calls for accountability, citing case numbers and dates from Sarah's evidence. The pressure becomes unbearable. In a final act of desperation, Barnes attempts to contact Alice through intermediaries, offering to tell his side of the story. But Alice recognizes the attempt for what it is, a last-ditch effort to control the narrative. As night falls, Sarah's final piece of evidence goes public, a recording of Barnes bragging about the system that protected him for years. His voice, slightly slurred from drinks after a shift, details exactly how they manipulated evidence and silenced complaints. The recording spreads across social media like wildfire. Barnes watches his phone light up with notifications, each one another nail in the coffin of his career. The protective walls he relied on for years are crumbling, leaving him exposed to the consequences of his actions. The FBI field office buzzes with activity as agents process Sarah's evidence. Surveillance photos cover the walls, connecting Barnes to other corrupt officers. Times, dates, and locations create a damning timeline of systematic abuse. The investigation has expanded beyond police brutality into organized crime. Outside, the city holds its breath. The largest protest yet assembles in front of police headquarters, but this one is different. Alongside community activists stand current and former police officers, breaking their silence about corruption they've witnessed. The thin blue line is fracturing. Sarah's evidence reaches the district attorney's office. Within hours, search warrants are issued for multiple precincts. As FBI agents move through police stations, officers watch their computers being confiscated, their files seized. The cleaner's careful system of protection collapses under federal scrutiny. Alice Turner prepares for her most important address yet. The media has gathered in force, cameras trained on the federal building steps. She stands straight, her injuries now healed but the memory of Barnes's assault still fresh. "What we're uncovering isn't just about police brutality," she begins. "It's about a criminal enterprise operating within law enforcement. Officers who swore to protect and serve instead created a system of intimidation and profit." Behind her, screens display evidence, maps showing patterns of evidence tampering, graphs illustrating complaint dismissals, transcripts of recorded conversations. Each piece fits into a larger picture of corruption that spans years. Jamal organizes the crowd's response. As each piece of evidence appears, protesters hold up corresponding case files, real people affected by the corruption. The visual impact is powerful, thousands of citizens holding proof of injustice that can no longer be denied. Inside police headquarters, panic spreads. Officers rush to delete files, shred documents, and clear their phones. But Sarah's meticulous documentation has already captured everything. Years of digital footprints can't be erased quickly enough. The protest reaches its peak as families affected by police misconduct take the podium. Their stories, once dismissed, now have concrete evidence to support them. Each testimony lands like a hammer blow against the department's credibility. "My son was arrested on planted evidence," one mother declares. "Today, we have proof of who did it and how they covered it up." She holds up documents Sarah uncovered, showing exactly how evidence was manipulated in her son's case. Barnes watches from his lawyer's office as his former colleagues begin making deals with prosecutors. Each hour brings new revelations, new names, new evidence. The cleaners' network unravels as members turn on each other, each trying to save themselves. As evening approaches, Alice takes the podium one final time. The crowd falls silent, sensing the weight of the moment. "Today marks a turning point," she announces. "Not just for Atlanta, but for every city where corruption wears a badge. Change isn't coming, it's here." The protest transforms into a candlelight vigil. Thousands of lights illuminate the gathering darkness, each flame representing a case that will now be re-examined, a wrong that might finally be righted. Sarah watches from the FBI office, knowing her police career is over but feeling lighter than she has in years. Her evidence has done more than expose Barnes, it's revealed a system of corruption that can no longer hide in the shadows. The federal courthouse fills to capacity for Barnes's hearing. Alice Turner sits in the front row, her FBI badge prominent, a silent reminder of how his routine brutality backfired. Next to her, Sarah Mitchell reviews her testimony notes, her hands steady despite the weight of what she's about to reveal. Barnes enters in handcuffs, his former swagger replaced by barely concealed fear. The officer who once terrorized neighborhoods now looks diminished in his orange jumpsuit. His eyes dart around the courtroom, noting former colleagues who now sit on the prosecution's side. The evidence unfolds methodically. Prosecutors present Sarah's documentation, FBI surveillance, and community testimony in a devastating sequence. Video screens display Barnes's history of misconduct, each incident now supported by proof of cover-ups and corruption. The defendant didn't just abuse his authority, the prosecutor states. He was part of a criminal enterprise operating within the police department. Each act of brutality was followed by systematic evidence tampering and witness intimidation. Community members fill the public gallery, many wearing shirts with Alice's image and the words, "Truth will rise." They watch in silence as years of injustice are finally exposed in a court of law. But Alice struggles privately with the emotional toll. During breaks, she sits alone in empty conference rooms, processing the impact of her role. Her bruises have healed, but the psychological effects linger. The facade of the tough FBI agent occasionally cracks, revealing the grandmother who endured public humiliation and assault. It was never just about Barnes, she confides to Jamal during a recess. It was about giving voice to every person who couldn't fight back, every complaint that was buried, every case that was dismissed. The legislative impact spreads beyond Atlanta. State lawmakers begin drafting police reform bills, using evidence from the case to justify stricter oversight. Other cities launch their own investigations, recognizing similar patterns of abuse. Barnes's defense crumbles as former allies turn state's evidence. Officers who once participated in the cleaners' activities now detail their operations, how they selected targets, manipulated evidence, and maintained their code of silence. Sarah's testimony proves most damaging. She methodically outlines the internal system that protected corrupt officers, supported by years of documented incidents. Her insider perspective, combined with her meticulous evidence gathering, leaves no room for denial. But the real power comes from community impact statements. Dozens of victims step forward, their previously dismissed complaints now validated by evidence. Each story builds upon the last, creating a devastating picture of systemic abuse. A mother describes how her teenage son was framed by planted evidence. A business owner recounts years of harassment and extortion. A retired teacher details how her complaints about police misconduct were repeatedly lost. Their testimonies, once ignored, now echo through federal court. Alice feels each story personally, remembering her own moment of vulnerability on that hot Atlanta pavement. But she also sees hope in the faces of community members who finally feel heard, in the young officers choosing to speak out, in the system beginning to change. The hearing stretches into evening. Outside, protesters maintain their vigil, their numbers growing as more evidence becomes public. Inside, Barnes sits slumped at the defense table, watching as his world of impunity collapses. The verdict comes down like a thunderbolt. Derek Barnes is found guilty on all counts. Beyond the assault on Alice Turner, he's convicted of evidence tampering, witness intimidation, civil rights violations, and participating in a criminal enterprise. The judge's sentence is severe, 25 years in federal prison. But the true revelation comes during the final phase of the investigation. FBI agents, following leads from Sarah's evidence, uncover Barnes's connection to a multi-state criminal network. His brutality wasn't just about racism or power, it was part of a coordinated effort to control certain neighborhoods for drug trafficking and money laundering. The corruption went deeper than anyone imagined, Alice announces at the final press conference. Officer Barnes wasn't just a racist cop abusing his power. He was a paid enforcer for a criminal organization that had infiltrated multiple police departments. The evidence trail reveals how the cleaners served as intermediaries between corrupt officers and criminal enterprises. They didn't just cover up police brutality, they facilitated criminal activities, using their badges as shields. Jamal organizes one final protest, but this time it's more celebration than demonstration. Thousands gather in front of the federal courthouse, holding signs that read, "Justice served" and "Change is here." The crowd includes police officers standing alongside community members, symbolizing a new era of accountability. Sarah, though no longer a police officer, receives recognition from the FBI for her role in exposing the corruption. She's offered a position as a consultant on police reform initiatives, her experience providing valuable insight into how departments can prevent similar infiltration. Alice, her undercover work finally complete, addresses the crowd. "What happened to me was terrible," she says, "but it exposed something far worse. Today isn't just about punishing one officer. It's about dismantling a system that allowed corruption to flourish." The reforms begin immediately. The Atlanta Police Department undergoes a complete restructuring. New oversight committees are established, including community members and civil rights advocates. Body camera requirements are strengthened, and complaint procedures are revamped to ensure transparency. Barnes, facing decades in prison, finally breaks his silence. His detailed confession implicates dozens of other corrupt officers and criminal associates across multiple states. The investigation expands, leading to arrests in police departments nationwide. Jamal emerges as a leading voice in police reform, working alongside progressive officers to build trust between law enforcement and communities. The young activist who once organized protests now helps shape policy, turning anger into action. The story of Alice Turner, the grandmother who brought down a corrupt police network, becomes a symbol of hope and resistance. But she remains humble, returning to her community work with a new focus on mentoring young people interested in law enforcement careers. Real change, she tells a group of police academy candidates, comes from inside and outside the system working together. What we exposed wasn't just about bad officers, it was about good people staying silent. That silence ends now. The final scene unfolds at a community center in Sweet Auburn, where it all began. Alice, Sarah, and Jamal sit together, watching as community members and police officers engage in honest dialogue about building a better future. On the wall behind them hangs a frame containing Alice's torn pamphlets from the day of her assault, now preserved as a reminder. Below them, a simple phrase reads, "Justice is not just about punishment, it's about transformation." As evening falls, Alice steps outside, looking at her city with new eyes. The streets where Barnes once patrolled are different now. There's still work to be done, challenges to face, trust to rebuild. But something fundamental has changed. The system didn't just lose a corrupt officer, it gained a blueprint for reform, a model for accountability, and a reminder that justice, though delayed, can still prevail.